Something satisfying just happened on the southern front, and I do not use that word lightly. In the last 36 hours, Ukraine struck and dropped a span of the one bridge that Russian military logistics in the southern sector cannot function without. I am not talking about a symbolic hit. I am not talking about cosmetic damage to a secondary crossing. I am talking about a confirmed structural collapse of a load-bearing span on a primary military supply route that feeds ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and reinforcements to Russian forces across an entire operational axis. When that span went into the water, so did Russia's ability to sustain the tempo it has been running on that front. And what I'm going to walk you through today is why this single bridge matters more than most people realize, why Russia cannot simply reroute around it, why the timing tells us something important about Ukrainian operational planning, and why this is not an isolated event. It is the latest proof that Russia's logistical architecture in occupied territory was never built to survive a war against an adversary that thinks this way. My name is Ben Hodges. I commanded the United States Army in Europe, and I want to spend the next 20 minutes showing you exactly what changed and why the consequences are going to cascade far beyond this one river crossing. Let me set the stage. The bridge in question sits on a critical supply artery connecting Russian rear area logistics hubs to forward positions in the south. I want you to picture the problem the way a logistics officer would. You have tens of thousands of troops deployed along a front that stretches hundreds of kilometers. Every single one of those soldiers needs ammunition. Every vehicle needs fuel. Every artillery piece needs shells. Every casualty needs evacuation. Every command post needs communication equipment, food, water, medical supplies. All of that material has to move from storage depots and railheads deep in Russian-held territory through a series of intermediate transfer points across natural obstacles, rivers, marshland, canals, and forward to the units that consume it. The bridge is where that supply chain crosses a gap it cannot cross any other way at the volume required. Ukraine did not stumble onto this target. This was the product of careful intelligence preparation, precision strike planning, and sequence targeting that tells me the Ukrainian General Staff understands Russian logistics better than Russia's own Ministry of Defense is willing to admit publicly. The strike reportedly involved a combination of precision-guided munitions, likely HIMARS or a similar long-range precision system, and the damage assessment that has emerged in the last 24 hours confirms that at least one full span has dropped. That means this is not a pothole. This is not something a Russian engineering battalion patches in 48 hours with steel plates and prayers. A drop span requires heavy bridging equipment, piling, structural engineering, and weeks of work, all under the constant threat that Ukraine will strike again the moment repair crews expose themselves. Stay with me, because here is where the operational meaning starts to compound. When you sever a primary supply route across a river, you do not simply inconvenience the units on the other side. You degrade their combat power on a sliding scale that gets worse every single day the bridge stays down. Day 1, forward units still have what was already in their local depots. Day 2 and 3, consumption starts outpacing resupply. By day 5, artillery begins rationing shells. By day 10, you are looking at units that cannot sustain offensive operations and are struggling to maintain defensive ones. That is the mathematics of logistics interdiction, and it is unforgiving. Now, someone watching this might ask, can't Russia just use another route? Let me be very direct about why the answer is functionally no, at least not at the scale required. Alternative crossings in this sector are either secondary roads that cannot handle heavy military traffic at volume, pontoon bridges that are themselves vulnerable to the exact same precision strike capability, or routes that add so many kilometers to the supply chain that transit times double or triple. And every additional hour a supply convoy spends on the road is another hour it is exposed to Ukrainian drones, artillery, and interdiction strikes. Russia has been trying to adapt to this problem since 2022. They have used pontoon bridges. They have used ferries. They have attempted underwater crossings. They have built bypass roads. And Ukraine has systematically found and hit every single one of those alternatives. That is not luck. That is a targeting cycle that has been refined over 2.5 years of war. Let me say that again because I want this to register. Ukraine is not randomly hitting bridges. Ukraine is executing a deliberate sequence campaign to dismantle Russian logistics networks node by node, crossing by crossing, depot by depot. What you are seeing with this bridge is not a single strike. It is the latest move in a campaign that has been compressing Russia's logistical capacity in the south for months. Now let me pivot to the related strikes that give this bridge hit its full context. Because viewed in isolation, you might think this is just one piece of damaged infrastructure. It is not. Watch this very carefully. Over the past several weeks, Ukraine has struck fuel depots, ammunition storage sites, rail junctions, and at least two other crossing points in the broader southern logistics network. Each of those strikes individually was manageable for Russian forces, painful, costly, but manageable. The genius of the Ukrainian approach, and I use that word deliberately, is that these strikes are not designed to be individually decisive. They are designed to be cumulatively catastrophic. Every depot that burns removes stored capacity that takes weeks to replace. Every rail junction that gets cratered forces traffic onto secondary lines that are slower, lower capacity, and more congested. Every crossing that drops forces rerouting onto roads that were never designed for military-scale throughput. And then you hit the one bridge that everything else was being rerouted through. That is what happened here. This was not the first strike. This was the culminating strike. Ukraine methodically eliminated the alternatives and then dropped the last efficient option. That is textbook interdiction doctrine executed at a level of precision and patience that, frankly, most NATO militaries would be proud of. The result is a logistics crisis that Russia cannot solve quickly. The forces on the far side of that river are now being fed through a straw when they need a fire hose. And every day that continues, their combat effectiveness degrades. You will start seeing the effects on the front lines within a week: reduced artillery fire rates, slower counterattack responses, units pulling back from exposed positions they can no longer sustain. Some of that is probably already happening as we speak, because commanders on the ground know what a dropped bridge means, even if Moscow's official channels are still pretending everything is under control. Now, I want to zoom out because this is where the story gets bigger and where most mainstream coverage stops too early. What this bridge strike exposes is not just a tactical problem for one Russian army group. It exposes a structural flaw in Russia's entire approach to sustaining this war in occupied Ukrainian territory. Russia inherited Soviet-era logistics infrastructure, rail lines, depots, road networks, that was designed for a different strategic reality. That infrastructure assumed that supply lines would run through friendly or controlled territory, that bridges and rail junctions would not be under constant precision attack, and that the enemy would not have the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability to map and target every node in real time. Every single one of those assumptions is now broken. Ukraine has HIMARS, Ukraine has Storm Shadow, Ukraine has an increasingly sophisticated fleet of domestically produced long-range drones. Ukraine has satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and a targeting apparatus that can identify a Russian logistics convoy, trace it back to its origin depot, and strike the depot before the convoy has finished unloading. Russia is fighting a 21st century logistics war with a system that was already showing its age in the 20th century. Stay with me, because the economic dimension makes this even worse for Moscow. Every bridge that drops, every depot that burns, every rail junction that gets cratered has a replacement cost. Russia is not just losing the military utility of these assets, it is spending finite construction resources, engineering units, and industrial output to rebuild things that Ukraine is going to hit again. This is the attrition trap that I have been warning about. Russia is being forced to pour resources into infrastructure repair on a scale that competes directly with its ability to produce new weapons, train new soldiers, and sustain its war economy. You cannot build replacement bridges and replacement tanks and replacement artillery barrels all at the same time when your industrial base is already running at strained capacity and your skilled labor pool has been depleted by mobilization, emigration, and casualties. The numbers tell the story. Russia has now lost, by credible estimates, well over 1 million casualties in this war: killed, wounded, captured, and missing. Those are not just soldiers. Many of those men were the welders, electricians, heavy equipment operators, and engineers who would be rebuilding these bridges and rail lines. Russia is cannibalizing its own reconstruction capacity every time it feeds another wave of poorly trained conscripts into the front line. And here is the diplomatic dimension that I want you to hold alongside everything else. This strike comes at a moment when multiple conversations are happening. In Washington, in European capitals, in Ankara, in Beijing, about what the trajectory of this war looks like over the next 6 to 12 months. Every time Ukraine demonstrates that it can systematically degrade Russian logistics, it strengthens the argument that Russia cannot sustain this war indefinitely at its current scale. That matters for sanctions enforcement. It matters for continued military aid to Ukraine. It matters for the calculations that every government in the world is making about whether to treat Russia as a power that is winning or a power that is slowly being ground down. Let me say this clearly. What Ukraine demonstrated with this bridge strike is not just the ability to hit a target. It is the ability to think sequentially, to plan a campaign of interdiction, to prioritize targets based on network analysis, and to execute strikes at the time and place that maximizes systemic disruption. That is what a military that has learned how to fight looks like. That is the kind of operational maturity that comes from 2.5 years of brutal combat combined with Western training, Western intelligence sharing, and Ukrainian ingenuity that is, in my judgment, among the most impressive military adaptation stories of the 21st century. Russia's response options are limited and none of them are good. They can attempt to rebuild the bridge under fire, which risks losing engineering assets and personnel to follow up strikes. They can try to establish pontoon crossings, which are slower to use and even more vulnerable. They can attempt to reroute supplies through alternative corridors, which adds days to delivery timelines and exposes convoys to interdiction along unfamiliar routes. Or they can reduce the forces they are trying to sustain on the far side of that river, which means giving up ground, something that is politically unacceptable to the Kremlin even when it is militarily rational. Watch this very carefully over the coming days. If Russia attempts a pontoon crossing within the next 72 hours, that will tell you they are in emergency logistics mode. If they begin pulling forces back from forward positions on that axis, that will tell you the supply situation is already critical. And if Ukraine hits the repair effort, which I fully expect them to attempt, that will tell you this bridge is not coming back into service anytime soon. Now let me give you the forecast, because this is where I want to leave you with something to think about. What we are witnessing in the south is not a single event. It is the maturation of Ukraine's deep strike interdiction campaign into a genuine strategic capability. 2 years ago, Ukraine was hitting bridges with improvised solutions and hoping for the best. Today, Ukraine is running a systematic logistics destruction campaign that maps Russian supply networks, identifies critical nodes, eliminates alternatives in sequence, and then collapses the keystone at the moment of maximum impact. That trajectory has not peaked. It is still accelerating. As Ukraine receives additional long-range strike systems, as its domestic drone production continues to scale, and as its targeting intelligence becomes more refined, the problem for Russia does not stabilize, it gets worse. Every month, Ukraine can reach deeper, strike more accurately, and sustain its interdiction campaigns for longer periods. Russia, meanwhile, is trying to defend an ever-expanding list of critical infrastructure targets with an air defense network that has itself been degraded by Ukrainian strikes. The strategic momentum on the logistics front has shifted, not because of one bridge, but because of the system that dropped that bridge. Russia is fighting a war of mass and attrition against an adversary that has figured out how to make precision count at the system's level. And the uncomfortable truth for Moscow is that there is no easy counter to an opponent who can see your supply lines, map your network dependencies, and take out your critical crossings faster than you can rebuild them. This bridge was not just a bridge. It was a load-bearing pillar in a logistics architecture that was already cracking. And when it went into the river, it took with it a set of assumptions that the Russian military has been relying on since the first day of this invasion, that occupied territory could be supplied indefinitely, that engineering could keep pace with destruction, and that Ukraine would never develop the capability to systematically dismantle the logistical foundation of Russia's southern front. Those assumptions are now in the water alongside the bridge span. I will be right here watching every development as it unfolds, and I will break it down for you the moment the next piece of this story lands. If this analysis helped you understand what is actually happening, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find this kind of breakdown. Drop a comment and tell me what you think Russia's next move on this axis will be, because I genuinely want to hear your read on it. Stay with this story. It is moving fast, and what happens at that crossing over the next 10 days may reshape the southern front for the rest of the summer.